about the Kennedy assassination with Fred Litwin. He is the author of Oliver Stone's Film Flam, The Demagogue of Dealey Plaza. And Fred is the author of four other books. He's written articles for the National Post, the Ottawa Citizen, Toronto Sun. Among his books, On the Trail of Delusion, Jim Garrison, the Great Accuser, exposed the fraudulent prosecution of Clay Shaw for conspiring to murder JFK. And first of all, Fred, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to just ask you a bit. I'd like you to talk a little bit about how you got interested in and involved in the study of the Kennedy assassination.
It all started back in March of 1975 when I was 18 years old, sitting at home watching the Geraldo Rivera show at 11:30 at night.
Mhm.
And he played the Zapruder film for the first time on national television. That was the best film of the assassination. And of course, the film shows that after the fatal headshot, Kennedy's head goes back and to the left. And so that got me wondering, why on earth do people think he was shot from behind? And that started my quest to find out what really happened.
I kind of share that. I mean, not the Geraldo part, but a lifelong interest in this subject. Being a little kid at the time of the assassination, I nevertheless remember it. I remember how traumatic it was. And it's always seemed like something that there was something bigger going on than that which was portrayed by the Warren Commission. I can't really point to it, but it was a gut feeling about that, even as a kid. And there's something very sinister about it. And also that maybe was reinforced by the fact that I think that generally the Kennedy assassination led to a major change in the way we were governed as a nation and in our society. So you have to wonder who gained, who benefited, as the Latins saying, cui bono, from the assassination. But your book seems to focus on debunking many of the conspiracy theories, particularly those promulgated by filmmaker Oliver Stone in his semi-documentary, JFK, which I saw years ago. I can't remember the details, but it had a lot in it. So let's start with the actual, the nitty-gritty of the case. I mean, what was going on with him, and what was going on with that film?
Well, first off, two things here. I mean, Oliver Stone did his feature film JFK in December 1991. He really wanted to talk about Vietnam. That was the whole subtext of the movie, that Kennedy did not want to fight a war in Vietnam, and that basically the military-industrial complex had him killed. Unfortunately for Oliver Stone, once the film came out, people didn't really want to talk about Vietnam. They wanted to talk about trajectories and bullets and the headshot and all the various minutiae of the assassination. And he spent a year defending the minutiae in various articles in the mainstream press. Now, fast forward to 2021, Oliver Stone released a 4-hour documentary series on the JFK assassination. I think this was an attempt by Oliver Stone to say, I actually got the minutiae right. And here's my response to all of my critics over the years. I was right all along. The minutiae, I was right. Was a conspiracy. Here you go. And that's what he was trying to do with his new documentary series.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think that he went down all of the various rabbit holes and kind of showed them all in a film-like way. And I mean, did he not? I don't know if he was trying to answer them, but he definitely raised them. And one of the first issues that he raised was all of these sort of swirling questions around the creation of the Warren Commission and the fact that on that commission was a representative from the CIA. I think it was Alan Dulles, and also the FBI, which happened to have been Representative Gerald Ford at the time, and other people who basically came to the conclusion that of the single gunman, lone gunman theory, the lone nut, the lone communist standing up on the window of the Texas School Book Depository, that being Lee Harvey Oswald. And that just didn't seem to it looked like an establishment sort of cover up of the type that we've gotten used to in this country in terms of how these things are handled. I mean, a more recent example would be the 9/11 Commission, which basically didn't name any names of anyone, and it just had a lot of vagary in it that seemed unsatisfactory in terms of actually going in and taking a hard look at what happened.
Well, first off, I say I do believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman. And the reason that Alan Dulles, who was the CIA, ex-head of the CIA, the reason he was on the Warren Commission was that Robert Kennedy wanted him on the Warren Commission. He asked
Hmm.
Johnson, please put Dulles on the Warren Commission. I think that Dulles was there to actually protect the Kennedys' interests because they had been busy trying to assassinate Castro using the CIA.
Right.
There was nothing untoward about having Dulles on there from the Kennedy perspective. The sad fact is that the evidence is overwhelming that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman and that there was no conspiracy.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure that, I mean, from my own kind of amateurish standpoint, that I can agree with that. I mean, it seems like there's evident. What about, the Umbrella Man and
The
the
Umbrella
gra
Man was identified by the House Select Committee on Assassinations. We know exactly who he was. His name was Lewis Witt. And the
Mhm.
reason he brought an umbrella that day was a symbol of appeasement of Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy. The umbrella was the symbol of appeasement for Neville Chamberlain, and that's why he brought an umbrella that day.
Well, you mean one of the people I interviewed recently on this topic was Dr. Jerome Corsi, who wrote a book about, he covered all of the conspiracy theories. Didn't really endorse any of them, but he documented them all pretty well. And one of the areas that he went into somewhat of a deep dive on was the fact that you had witnesses um, noticing gunshots coming from various directions. I mean, could it really have been like four bullets coming in from this one man standing
This
up in
this
the
is this is
window?
very easy to counter. Look, Daley Plaza was an echo chamber, and so people heard echoes from different directions. But I'll tell you what's interesting. Of all the witnesses, almost all of them claim the gunshots came from one direction. Some thought from the Texas School Book Depository, some thought from the Knoll, but there were only two or three witnesses who thought they came from two different directions. And
Mhm.
that to me is very telling.
Well, what about the Zapruder film, which shows Kennedy, the first shot, he kind of jerked forward, and then the second shot, he jerked back, and it looked
No,
like they were coming
no,
from different
no,
directions.
that's just not true. What the Zapruder film shows quite clearly is between frame 312 and 313, when Kennedy was hit in the head, his head goes forward for 2 inches and then it goes back. So the head goes forward from the impact of the bullet and it goes back from a neuromuscular spasm. And the fact, like a jet engine, there's a mass of material that's exiting from the front of his head, pushing his head backwards. There's nothing mysterious about his head movement.
What about, you say, the relationship between JFK and the CIA? I mean, you mentioned that there were these weird and kind of amateurish attempts to assassinate Castro by using like a bomb in a cigar, this sort of stuff. What
Yeah.
was going on with that?
The Kennedys hated Castro. I mean, the Kennedys wanted Castro gone. I mean, they were obsessed with Castro. And so they did whatever they could to get rid of Castro. And they were the ones that were directing the CIA to kill Castro.
What about the theory that holds that Kennedy, because he contradicted the interests of the generals at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis? I don't know if it was Curtis LeMay, but I think it was some of the establishment military brass who wanted to, go in and have a war with the Soviet Union, and Kennedy stood them down. That they had a grudge that they didn't like Kennedy for that.
Well, the question is, who is they? I mean, Kennedy put in his own man as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Maxwell Taylor. You can't say he hated Kennedy. Now,
Mhm.
Curtis LeMay, the reason that Kennedy, I mean, Curtis LeMay may not have liked Kennedy, and Curtis LeMay was a bit of a hothead. But why was Curtis LeMay kept in his job? And this is quite, Kennedy made this quite clear. He said, I don't take my political advice from Curtis LeMay, but he is a great organizer of the Air Force. He does a terrific job, and that's why I'm keeping him in that position.
Okay. um, what about the involvement possibly? And this is uh, I think it's actually what's his name, Stone, the other guy who talks about this, who wrote a book about it, of Lyndon Johnson's involvement. I mean, the morning of the assassination, the Boston Globe had an article basically saying that Kennedy was dumping Johnson as his vice presidential candidate, and that Johnson, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with that in terms of Johnson positioning Kennedy in the car and all the stuff that Stone gets into. Do you think there's any foreknowledge on the part of Johnson that this thing was coming down?
No, not at all. And there's no evidence to support that at the slightest. I would strongly suggest that you should not read Roger Stone on the
Roger
assassination. I
Stone.
read his book. It's not very good.
Hmm.
And there's just no evidence to sustain that at all.
And what about Officer Tippit? But who killed? He was like shot like right after the assassination. I think it had some association with Oswald hiding in the movie theater. What happened with that?
Well, this is another clear example of where Oswald was guilty. Oswald, after the assassination, left work and went to his rooming house to get his pistol. He
Hmm.
then left his rooming house, and around 15 minutes later, he was stopped by Officer Tippit. And Officer Tippit went around the car, and Oswald shot him 4 times and then ran off. And there was one witness who saw Oswald shoot him, but there were 7 witnesses who saw him both run away and unload his pistol on somebody's lawn, where they actually retrieved the cartridge cases, which were ballistically traced to Oswald's gun. He then ran and ultimately went into a movie theater without buying a ticket, and people saw him, and he looked suspicious.
Hmm. And what about Jack Ruby? I mean, he came into the police station right on broad while it was broadcasting on television. I mean, I remember seeing this,
Yep.
and he assassinated Oswald. Why and who is he?
Well, Jack Ruby was a nightclub owner in Dallas. He actually owned a strip club, and he was sort of a kind of a self-made promoter who was always going around town promoting any one of his business ventures and his clubs. He would talk to anybody. He loved talking to journalists, to the police. He'd be the last person the mob would ever hire to do anything. But basically, he was going slightly crazy that weekend. On Friday morning in the Dallas Morning News, there was a full-page ad criticizing Kennedy's foreign policy, and it was signed by Bernard Weissman, a Jewish name. And Ruby saw that. And after the assassination, he really worried that perhaps the Jewish people could be linked to this person, and the Jews could be blamed for the assassination. And so
Hmm.
he went to that post office to see if he could find out who is this guy Bernard Weissman. Of course, they wouldn't tell him. He did see that the post office box was full, and that started him on a mental decline that weekend. And he was also taking diet pills. And on the Sunday morning, he got a call from one of his strippers. She needed money because he had closed the club that weekend because of the assassination. So he went to the Western Union office, which was a block away from the police station, at 11 o'clock Sunday morning, wired the money, came out, saw there was some commotion at the police station, walked down the ramp, and it just coincided when Oswald was being brought out. He took one shot, hit Oswald in the stomach. Oswald actually almost lived. It was a impulsive act on the part of Jack Ruby.
And then what happened to Jack Ruby?
Well, the interesting thing is, because it was an impulsive act, after the fact, he had to come up with a reason. Why did you do this? And he came up with many different reasons. The first one was to save Jackie Kennedy from coming to Dallas for a trial. Then he told a police officer he wanted to show the people that Jews had balls. He had a variety of, it was an impulsive act, so he had a variety of explanations. He went to
Right.
trial. He was convicted. He appealed, saying that the venue was biased against him. He won on appeal, and he was going to have a new trial in Wichita, but he developed lung cancer and died in prison in January 1967.
Right. And speaking of Jewish conspiracy theories I've been seeing floating around the anti-Semitic side of the internet particularly after the Hamas slaughter in Israel.
Yeah.
This idea that the Jews or Israelis had a hand in the assassination because Kennedy wanted to stop the development of the Dimona nuclear plant in Israel. So which is, by the way, I mean, I think that the truth is that they were not, they were being pressured to stop that plant, but not just by Kennedy. I mean, it was only until Nixon that they got a kind of a green light on Dimona. So I mean, I don't think that's likely.
No, I mean, look, Kennedy did not want them to develop a nuclear bomb, of course, and he
Right.
wanted inspection at Dimona, which they did agree to
Yes.
right after he was killed. I mean, it would have been ludicrous for the Israelis to say, "Oh, he doesn't want us to do stuff at Dimona." Well, the answer is we'll kill him. I mean, it's just nonsense to think that they would have said that or thought that.
And what about the mob connection? I mean, I think that wasn't Jack Ruby part of the a mob that felt betrayed by the Kennedys since they might have had a hand in helping him get elected, and then afterwards Robert Kennedy really kind of cracked down in terms of going after them.
Well, that's true. I mean, they did. The mob was really unhappy at Bobby Kennedy going after them. Jack Ruby was not part of the mob. He's the last person you'd have in the mob, and he was a blabbermouth. He talked to everybody. He may have wanted to be, or but he was not part of the mob. Look, the problem for the mob is that they probably would have liked to have gotten rid of Kennedy, but they cannot be sure that they can get away with it. It's not good enough to kill Kennedy and then be caught, because that's even worse. You have to kill him and get away with it, and they could never be sure they can get away with it. So I don't think they would have done that.
So then your contention is basically that he just happened to be riding in an open air car and that this one man stood up in a window and just shot him.
Yep, that's what happened.
I mean, it just, it seems like there must have been some major screw ups, at least. I mean, I think I interviewed years ago one of the Secret Servicemen who was there, and wasn't there a an order for them to sort of stand down
No,
particularly as they went around the corner?
no,
So you couldn't find anything like that.
no. I mean, this is again, there's a lot of nonsense swirling around this case. I mean, even Kennedy said to some of his aides a few days before the assassination that it would be so easy for somebody to kill him from a building with a rifle. That's the
Well,
way
then
it was back then. It
why was
hard.
he riding in an open air car then in the middle of a major city if they knew
This
this?
is the early 1960s. I mean, Kennedy loved being out with it. And look at what happened when he rode in Tampa. In Tampa, before Dallas, Kennedy was standing in the limousine going through the streets of Tampa, standing.
Right. Oh, I mean that I think you may have a point on because I know that even like Eisenhower would like to stand and people would be cheering as he, especially after he came back from the war, and there was kind of like a maybe an innocence about that. I don't
Yeah, it was a
know. I
different
mean,
time.
but it just there's so many things that just seem to come together in terms of a lot of speculation about whether or not Kennedy had stated that he wanted to pull out of Vietnam a few months before the assassination, which is something that what Eisenhower himself called the military-industrial complex. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to escalate Vietnam, and that right after the assassination, within a week, within days of the assassination, Lyndon Johnson already was meeting with people and starting the escalation. So, I only mentioned that, and there's other things that we could
If
talk
that was
about.
true, that's not true. But if that was true, you might
Yeah.
have a point. None of that is true.
So then Johnson didn't escalate in Vietnam within
Not well,
days.
he did ultimately escalate, but not right away. In fact, Lyndon Johnson's first national security order, NSAM 273, was a rewrite of SSAM 263, which Kennedy was in the midst of writing, and there were just very, very minor changes between what Kennedy was going to submit and what Johnson did. The fact is that we don't know what Kennedy would have done had he lived. He was very committed to supporting a free South Vietnam. South Vietnam. Just check his speech that he would have given in Dallas. The speech that he would have given in Dallas was all about supporting Vietnam, pride in his defense expenditures, all the new weapon systems that was coming online. He was very committed. Now, there was a plan to get out of Vietnam, but it was all predicated on the South Vietnamese taking over the war effort. And of course, Diem was assassinated and deposed on November 2nd, and that changed everything.
Right. Apparently, Kennedy was extremely upset about that when that news
No, he
came
was
in.
upset at the assassination. He okayed that he was deposed.
Right, and then within a day or two after that, he was found stuffed in the back of a car along with
So,
his brother.
but that created a massive crisis in Vietnam, and Viet Cong attacks escalated dramatically, and so the whole situation in Vietnam changed. We'd have no idea what Kennedy would have done in that situation because he was killed.
Right, and then there's the monetary conspiracy that I've read about, that Kennedy had authorized the minting of silver dollars directly from Fort Knox, as opposed to borrowing Federal Reserve notes, which made the establishment unhappy, because there would be it was interest-free money being introduced into the economy, and that particular directive was rescinded by Lyndon Johnson very quickly after the assassination.
I don't think that's
I
true
think that
either.
was William Marr was the one who said that.
Well, I think that pick one. The problem
Right.
here is that we have all these different conspiracies, all these different, and we're left with the undeniable fact that Oswald was the lone gunman. Now, how do you take any of these so-called people who might have wanted Kennedy dead and relate that back to Oswald, who actually fired the shots? Show me some evidence of that.
Well, I mean, it all comes down to what actually did happen there,
And
and
we
there were
know what happened. I mean, this is
there
the
were
thing.
just there were various very interesting people, and people who have gone very deeply into this, who dispute what happened in terms of the actual literal gunshots and all of that. I
But
mean,
we've had two
I respect
investigations.
your opinion on it, Fred, but you're
No,
not the only
we've had
person.
two investigations of the JFK assassination, the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations, and both investigations came to the conclusion that Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots and killed Kennedy.
Well, then why aren't they releasing all the classified information even now? I mean, I
Well,
think
guess
that it
what?
was. I think that
This
actually.
is
Well, wait a minute. They were
they have
supposed to. They release about 80% of it, but
no, no,
then
no,
when when Trump was president, he released a good deal of it, but he didn't release all of it.
no.
And
You
and
don't
he was
understand
at
here.
and he was asked about that by Stone, who basically said, he said, "Look, I'm not going to release all of it because it's horrible, because it's too
Oh,
ugly for the American people to even know what the rest
well,
of it."
sometimes even Donald Trump is known to embellish the truth. Here's the truth.
Well,
Tell
did
you
he?
the truth.
Is it all released then? No, I mean, I think that there
Well,
is still a
let
portion.
me just tell you, the only documents that are withheld in full, where the whole document has not been released, are IRS records and grand jury testimony, which are exempt from the JFK Records Act. The other documents that we're talking about have all been released, but with redactions. So I'll give you an example of why some stuff is redacted. There are 400 documents that have been redacted where the social insurance numbers of people who are still alive, they've been redacted. Now, there's no reason to release that.
Right.
Informants back in the 60s who were promised by the government anonymity until they die might still be alive. The Assassinations Records Review Board saw all of those redactions. They saw all those documents unredacted. And if you speak to Judge Tunheim, who is chairman of that board, he'll tell you there's nothing in those documents.
Well, I mean, speaking of informants, what about? I mean, I think it was E. Howard Hunt who said that he felt he was involved in a CIA aspect of the assassination just before he died.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, if you actually go back to the tape of his so-called deathbed confession, it's not much of a confession. Go
Hmm.
watch the whole thing and come back and tell me if you think that's a real confession.
Okay, I mean, I don't, I haven't. I believe I
This is the
interviewed his
problem here
son.
is that people there's all this stuff swirling around, but when you really look at this in detail, um, there's nothing to some of this stuff.
Well, maybe some of it. What about the long list of what I would call the death count?
Give me one name.
Right,
Give me one name.
Dorothy Kilgallen.
Dorothy Kilgallen overdosed on barbiturates and alcohol. Her death was, in those days, the barbiturates and the way people took barbiturates was not like it is today, where it's much more measured. She overdosed. She had. There's nothing about her death that's mysterious.
Cord Mayor's wife.
What about his wife?
She was shot while jogging in Washington along the Baltimore Canal or something like that.
And so what?
She Well, she had some kind of a. They say that she was sort of a whistleblower. She was about to say, and he was a kind of a deep player in the CIA.
Perhaps. But again, what's the relationship to the JFK assassination?
That
People
she was
do get shot. People do get murdered.
right,
People die of
but
natural
there's
causes all the time.
no, of course, but there's a pretty extensive list of people who have coincidentally died who had some proximity to the Kennedy assassination or to Lyndon Johnson right after it.
I mean,
Um,
look at. I've gone through the list. I mean, some of it is laughable. I mean, Earlene Roberts, she was the
mhm.
housekeeper at the boarding house where Oswald lived. That was a mysterious death, but she was a lifelong smoker and she died of congestive heart failure. She had an autopsy. It was natural. I mean, you can go through this one by one. This is a real big canard. There is nothing there.
And there were a lot of important people who were close to the situation, including Robert Kennedy, and including Kennedy's secretary Lincoln, who believed that Johnson was involved in it.
Well, look, there's no question. There's a lot of people, important, very important people who may believe there's a conspiracy. Do they have special knowledge? Very important people aren't exempt from conspiracy thinking.
I
But
don't know if
because
I
they
think that
believe in
it's
a
more
conspiracy,
than
RFK
thinking. I mean,
Jr. may believe in a conspiracy, but does he have any special knowledge about what happened? No, he doesn't.
I think that he probably has some knowledge of things that you can't. These are things that are very difficult to prove, but there's evidence. He's heard things
Show
said
me the
by.
evidence.
I think that
I've gone through everything RFK Jr. has said about the assassination. He's wrong on so many points. His knowledge of what happened is so shallow and so incredibly wrong. And I've written this. I've done like 9 blog posts on what RFK has said, and it's embarrassing.
I wouldn't say embarrassing. I mean, he's researched the thing, and plus the
He
death,
just
the
he
murder
just
of
said
his
last
father.
week that Woody Harrelson's dad was involved in the assassination. Come on, give me a
Well,
break.
what was his claim about Woody Harrelson's dad? Wasn't he like I don't know, CIA or something like
No,
that?
he was a hitman and he was in prison.
Right.
But RFK Jr. claims that he was on the he was one of the tree tramps that was arrested that afternoon.
The other tramp I've heard was George H.W. Bush.
But we know who
I
the
don't know
tramps
about
were.
that
We
one.
have we have their
Yeah.
arrest records. We know exactly who they are. They were spoken to many years ago. They said they were. There's no mystery here.
Well, again, I mean, these are issues that are disputed by people that I think are informed. I don't think that they're making it up. They're not pulling it whole cloth. Uh,
Oh,
you
you'd be
know,
surprised. You'd be surprised. I've spent years debunking this stuff. I mean, if you're talking about, Mr. Corsi or come on, these are not serious assassination researchers.
I think he did a very. Did you read his book?
No, I won't read it. It's ridiculous.
I have read it, and I think it's. I think he's a very, very meticulous researcher. He
Well, you'd be
doesn't.
surprised.
Yes, he is. He doesn't come out and endorse any of the theories. He just simply puts them together in terms of what is known about each of them. And then at the end, he says, look, there's still why is it? This was before the more recent release of classified information, but he says that if you take a look at the whole picture of all of these different theories, you conclude that there's truth in all of them. I mean,
But
there's evidence.
that's an impossibility. Truth in all of them. They're all mutually exclusive.
They are, but yet they all had a common interest, apparently, in changing the government, overthrowing the existing administration and putting in place a new regime which changed the
I
whole
mean, let me
country.
give you one example of how silly some of this of. Take J. Edgar Hoover. They say, oh, J. Edgar Hoover really didn't like the Kennedys, really wanted to get rid of Kennedy. Well,
Right.
guess what? When JFK was having an affair with Judith Exner, Sam Giancana's girlfriend, J.
Mm.
Edgar Hoover knew about it. Now, in 1963, if he had leaked that to the press, that's a major national security problem. So what
Right.
does Hoover do? He doesn't leak
He
it to the
did
press.
nothing. Yeah.
No, he goes to the Kennedys and says, I'm warning you, you should stop this. This is not good.
Mm.
Now, come on. He could have sunk Kennedy. That would have sunk Kennedy dramatically. And I say this to a lot of people: an easier way of getting rid of Kennedy would to leaking something like that would have gotten rid of Kennedy. And by the way, you could have leaked it during the campaign against Barry Goldwater, and you could have elected Barry Goldwater, who would have been far more of a hawk than Lyndon Johnson.
Well, I don't know if that's true. I think Goldwater was calling for de-escalating the war in Vietnam, I believe, wasn't he?
No,
I don't know that, but Johnson was all in on
no, he wasn't.
escalation.
Actually, right in the beginning, he did not want to get involved in Vietnam.
Okay, I mean, I think that again, I think there were disputed accounts on that. I suppose we can't really know that because we kind of know the inner workings of Johnson's White House. But the escalation started to happen fairly quickly after the assassination, and then you had this whole launching of the big the war on all of these different big government programs, which none of which Kennedy probably would have been in on. So I mean, it just changed the way we were governed. I mean, it changed. You have to look at. I mean, anytime there's an assassination, I mean, there's the Lincoln assassination. I mean, these things change the entire. These are people who were pivotal, and there's a major change in how things are done in the aftermath. And there were interests that wanted that change, that wanted to have a different way of going about things. And I think the overall sweep of evidence is goes that in that direction with Kennedy, who was a much more conventional, even you might even say more conservative administration. I mean, he wasn't into this massive expansion of government, this international wars. He wanted to withdraw from this concept of perpetual war for perpetual peace, which has been in place
He
since
was a
World War
he was a
One.
Cold Warrior. JFK was a massive Cold Warrior.
Yes, but I
Committed.
don't think that he's wanted to commit American troops
We
around
don't
the
know.
world in this
We don't know what
perpetual
would have
war.
happened. I mean, go check his speech in Dallas that he was going to give. The whole speech was about
I will.
how much he was increasing the military budget, all the new weapons he was building, and the fact that he was dedicated to supporting the freedom of South Vietnam.
Okay, I mean, I will look at that. That's maybe he would have been as big an internationalist and as a
But we don't know.
interventionist.
The problem,
Right.
this is the big thing, is we just don't know. And you have to separate out. There's lots of people who may not have liked them and may want to get rid of them, but there's no evidence that they actually did that, because we know that Oswald pulled the trigger. There was one gunman. How do you get to Oswald?
Well, I mean, look, I don't think there's any question that Oswald did pull a trigger. Right? I mean, the question is whether or not there were other people involved in it.
How do you
And
get other people involved with Oswald? He was a loner who had no friends. We know what he was
yeah, but I
doing.
mean, I mean, that's a pretty good to get 4 shots off like that from
Three
from the
shots. No,
three.
he was
Okay.
a sharpshooter in the Marines.
Who was Oswald? Was Oswald like a communist setup? I mean, he spent years in the Soviet
He was a
Union,
Marxist.
and then yeah, but he also went to I think Mexico City just
He,
before the
because he
assassination.
wanted to go to Cuba. He was enamored with Fidel Castro. He loved Cuba. He thought the next big thing, the next big, the revolution in Cuba was the next big opportunity to get things right. He hated
Right.
America. He
Okay.
didn't like the Soviet Union. but Cuba was the cherry of his eye.
Well, his wife was the daughter of a Soviet general, I think,
Well, he
and
was
he's
a daughter of her uncle was in the
okay.
NKVD.
And he spent, I think, at least a year or two in the Soviet Union. I think in the
2 years,
late
yeah.
50s. So was this a Soviet? Um, did the Soviets send him as their sort of advanced person to take out Kennedy?
Well, hold it. Is it the Soviets or is it all these other people? I mean, I wish people would pick one
Well,
conspiracy
we
theory.
can look at all of it. We can look at
Well,
other people,
this is the problem here. Is
right now we're talking about Castro,
Yes, so the problem
about
here is
not
that
Castro,
the
Oswald.
Soviets really didn't like Oswald very much. They didn't really understand, why are you here? Who are you? And so they really decided, what we'll do is we'll send them off to Minsk. We'll put them to work in a radio factory, and that'll be the end of Oswald. The fact is that through the NSA, the United States got a lot of signals intelligence after the assassination, and was very clear to the Americans that the Soviets were not involved.
Okay, I mean that could have been something that maybe the Warren Commission wanted to brush over, and for good reason, in that we didn't want to have a nuclear war with Russia, So if Russia was involved in it, I get the fact that you kind of want to downplay it in the same way that George W. Bush downplayed Islamic involvement in 9/11. Do you want to have a war, a World War III? I mean, you kind of have to he had to come out and say, oh, well, this is, Islam's a religion of peace. And everybody kind of winked and said, okay, fine. We don't want to have a world war, a religious war. So maybe, they might have taken the position of, well, we can't really point too strong a finger at the Soviet Union because we want to avoid war. I get that. I mean, that's actually reasonable.
But again, you're right. They certainly wanted to avoid war, but they knew through the NSA that there was no evidence linking the Soviets to the crime.
Okay, that's your research, Fred. And I mean, I think that you've stated it here as you've researched it. How do people get your book?
Go to my website at www.onthetrailofdelusion.com, all one word, and I've got around 800 different articles for free on my website where I debunk a variety of conspiracy theories. You have links to my books and a lot of documents, primary documents. And I'll say this to anybody, don't believe me. I have all the links on my website to the primary documents. Go to the primary documents, read them for yourself. It's pretty clear there was no conspiracy.
Okay, I mean, there's delusion and there's delusional. Either way, I think that people can look at the entire body of work and make up their own mind. I mean, I think that all of it is worth studying. So, Fred Litwin, I want to thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much.
And I appreciate it. All right.
Okay.
Take
care.
All right. Thank you.
Bye.